This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I talk with fellow anti-diet advocates about their journey toward peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 227 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fellow anti-diet dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, Ayana Habtemariam. We discuss how she's bringing intuitive eating to marginalized communities, whether food environments actually influence health the way diet culture says they do, the oppressive roots of diet culture, paternalistic nutrition policies, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. It's a really good one. But first, I want to answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Kay, who writes, "Hi, Christy. I have an issue that I'd love you to address on the podcast. Here's the background. I'm 29 and have struggled with disordered eating through my teens, and I'm currently working on having a healthier relationship with food. Your podcast has helped me with this. My husband is much older than me. He's in his 50s, and he's been previously diagnosed as pre-diabetes and is considered quote-unquote overweight. He has a major sweet tooth and loves food that isn't good for him. I try to encourage him to eat healthier and exercise because since he's a lot older than me, I want him to be around for as long as possible. Sometimes I catch myself shaming him for not working out or for what he's eating, and I try to stop myself, but on the other hand, I feel it's important for me to encourage him to be healthy. I'm sure some of my own insecurities surrounding food and body weight get projected onto him when I'm doing this. I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to approach encouraging my husband to be more healthy overall without shaming him and going at it from a more health at every size approach. I can agree with you all I want while I'm listening to the podcast, but when it comes to real life, I still have stigmas about certain foods and body sizes. I'd love for my husband to be closer to the size he was when we first started dating, but I also know it's not as realistic as our lifestyle has changed. I love him no matter what, but I selfishly would like him to lose weight for my own reasons too, but I would never say that to him. I mask it in my concern for his health, which is also legitimate. Please help me be a better wife. Thank you." So thanks, Kay, for that great question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So yeah, I totally understand wanting to make sure your husband is okay and going to be around for as long as possible, and who wouldn't want that? And it sounds like your desire to get involved with his eating and exercise is mostly coming from a place of love. But here's the thing. Unfortunately, intent is not the same as impact. And it sounds like even though your intentions are mostly just to help him and mostly coming from a place of love, the impact your involvement is having is shaming him for his eating and movement choices and his body size. Because anytime we try to quote-unquote encourage other people in our lives to eat differently, like eat less of particular kinds of foods and more of others, and exercise more, they know what that means in our culture. They know that means you think their body is wrong and that their choices are wrong because they're supposedly leading to a larger body. And telling people to eat less and exercise more is pretty much always going to have a detrimental impact on their mental health because it shames them. It really trips that wiring that was installed by diet culture, that shamey wiring that says that larger bodies are quote unquote bad and that people are responsible for shrinking their bodies via eating less or eating differently and exercising more. And research actually shows that that message leads to increased levels of weight stigma, which we know is harmful to people's health regardless of their body size. So if you want lots more on that research, you can check out my book, Anti-Diet, where I do a deep dive into the science on weight stigma in chapter 5. I think that's super important and would be a good resource for you, Kay, as you think through and navigate your relationship with your husband and his food and his body. But not only does it create weight stigma to tell someone to eat less or less of particular foods and exercise more, but it also often just leads to the person rebelling against what you're saying and makes them want sweets or whatever other foods you've deemed quote unquote off limits all the more. It's that forbidden fruit quality. The forbidden fruit really tastes the sweetest. And if you're locked in a power struggle with him over what he's eating, it's probably just going to make him rebel. And I get into all of that in the book as well. So I know it's so hard to let go when you feel invested in his health because you obviously care a lot about him. But if you truly want to help his well-being, it's really important to stop stigmatizing certain foods and body sizes, stop policing his eating and exercise, and let him be. Because he's definitely picking up on that stigma. And research shows that weight stigma is actually a bigger risk to people's health than what they eat, as I've discussed on this podcast before and I discuss in my book as well. So shaming him for what he's eating is definitely doing the opposite of helping his health. Even though you think it's helping, it's actually doing harm. So eventually, yes, if you can truly and consistently stop stigmatizing him and shaming him, you two may get to a place where you can talk about your history of eating disorders or disordered eating, your history of enacting weight stigma on him, your own relationship with food in your body, and maybe at that point, he'll open up a bit about his relationship with food in his body. And at that point, you can support him and maybe talk to him about changes that he wants to make from a health at every size perspective. Maybe he eventually will want that. Maybe he'll want to engage in more physical activity from a HAES perspective or learn more about intuitive eating and how it can help his well-being and all of that. But I think it would be very difficult to have those conversations now, given that dynamic that you're in of stigmatizing him for his food and movement choices. Because again, even if he doesn't seem to be vocalizing that he gets it, that he's picking up on it, I think he knows what you're doing. You'd have to kind of live under a rock in our society not to know that kind of stuff is about weight stigma and stigmatizing people's food choices. So really the first priority is stopping stigmatizing him and working through your own internalized weight stigma and your own internalized food phobia, right? The fat phobia and food phobia that we all inherit from diet culture. Working through that stuff for yourself so that you can take a step back and not be stigmatizing him all the time. And then maybe eventually you'll get to a place where you can talk about his relationship with food and his body from a more neutral place or not. You know, maybe he'll never want to talk about that stuff with you. Maybe he's fine and happy eating what he's eating and moving how he's moving. And, you know, at the end of the day, we can't force anyone to do anything. And the efforts to force them really almost always backfire. Now, of course, we also need to address what you said at the end of your question about wanting him to look a certain way and how you mask that desire with concern for his health. I think that's really self-aware of you to notice that you're doing that because many people don't even realize that's happening and they're stigmatizing someone and wanting them to change how their body looks, but they're doing it under the guise of health and they never realize. So it's great that you've realized that. But the fact that you're wishing for his body to be smaller really also shows that you have a lot of internalized weight stigma. And it's so important to work on your own perception of beauty in order to change, in order to take away that stigma that you've developed from diet culture, right? Because diet culture conditions us to believe smaller bodies are better and more attractive, but that is simply not true. It's just the product of a system of beliefs that is oppressive, that oppresses larger bodies and worships smaller ones. And that system of beliefs has got to go because it's harming all of us. So I would really recommend working on deprogramming yourself from diet culture's conditioning about how men and masculine folks and really people in general, quote unquote, should look. For that, I would recommend exposing yourself to images of larger-bodied men and masculine people and unfollowing or unsubscribing from any media, social media, or otherwise that are reinforcing diet culture's standards of masculine beauty. So here are some good larger-bodied people and accounts to follow for this. First would be Aaron Flores, who is a 2-time past podcast guest and a fellow Health at Every Size dietitian. He shares great photos of himself on Instagram and, outfit of the day, plus size outfit of the day. He's so great and lovely. He is at Aaron Flores RDN on Instagram. There's also Jeff Jenkins, who has this great brand called Chubby Diaries for helping larger bodied people travel the world. And he is at Chubby Diaries __ on Instagram. Make sure you don't forget the __ because that it's a different person if you do just Chubby Diaries or Chubby Diaries with one _. We'll link to all this in the show notes too, so you don't forget. Then there's also Chubster, CHUBSTR, Chubster, a style website for big men, which is on Instagram at Chubster. There's the lovely Ross of Crake with Rossi, who is an awesome drag performer. He does a show called Cake Daddy. He's on Instagram at Crake with Rossi, CRAIC with Rossi, ROSSY. Then there's Zach Miko, who is a brawn model, aka plus size male model, who is on Instagram at Zach Miko, ZACHMIKO. And then finally, there is Kelvin Davis, another plus-size male model who shares a lot of great stuff, clothes, style, pictures of himself on Instagram, just having a great time. He has a lovely smile, seems like such a great person. He is at Kelvin Davis on Instagram. We'll link again to all these in the show notes. But, there's lots more, of course, accounts you could follow, but I think these are some good accounts to start with for rewiring your notion of masculine beauty and helping you see diverse men in larger bodies living their lives, having a great time, and just, looking fabulous. So important to rewire those standards of beauty because we've been so saturated with diet culture's version of beauty for wherever you fall on the gender spectrum. It's like, here's what masculine people are supposed to look like. Here's what feminine people are supposed to look like, not accounting for all of the vast diversity of human bodies and how we look and our sizes and shapes, and the fact that the vast majority of people in the Western world are larger than the cultural norm, the cultural ideal. So I hope that's helpful, Kay, for challenging these beliefs and starting to support your husband in a truly holistic way that accounts for his mental health, that accounts for his overall well-being, and not just getting locked in this power struggle where you're like the diet culture police and he is the rebellious teenager. You got to stop that dynamic and embrace who he is and allow him to have his own relationship with food, not clouded by weight stigma and fat phobia and food phobia. So if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want me to answer your questions much more quickly than I do here, you can come check out my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals, where I answer people's questions every month just for members of the course. And you also get a treasure trove of special content helping you work through the principles of intuitive eating. And you get access to our private community forum for daily support from my team and hundreds of awesome course members around the world as well. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. It's a great companion to this podcast because it goes into lots of depth about diet culture and the ways it harms us, and it has hundreds of scientific references and other resources to help you make the case about the anti-diet philosophy to the people in your life, and also make the case to yourself, help yourself fully understand this movement. And the book also lays out the foundation of intuitive eating and helps you start making peace with food and your body. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it, or go into any bookstore and ask for Anti-Diet. And speaking of bookstores, I will be in Washington, D.C. on February 21st and 22nd for not one, but two book events, one at a bookstore and one at this cool co-working space. And you can get all the details about these and my other upcoming events on my website at christyharrison.com/book. Also, if you've read the book already and loved it, which I know quite a few people listening have done, thank you so much. I so appreciate your tags on social media and all your shares about the book. And I would be so psyched if you left an Amazon review and marked all the other 5-star reviews as helpful, because those positive reviews help more people discover the book, which ultimately helps grow the anti-diet movement and make the world a safer place for people of all shapes and sizes, including the very largest sizes. So thank you in advance for helping spread the word about this book and about the anti-diet movement in general. This episode is also brought to you by ThreadUp. Right now, I'm doing a lot of touring and events to promote my book, and I kind of don't want to re-wear the same outfits because I don't want to look exactly the same in all the pictures, so I've had to buy some new clothes. And thankfully, ThreadUp is helping me do that in a way that is kind to my wallet without compromising my style. ThreadUp is the world's largest online thrift store with up to 90% off estimated retail. Instead of spending hours at the racks, you can customize your search on ThreadUp by your size, including plus sizes, your style, and your budget, so you can find the best deals instantly. Everything is in high-quality condition, and lots of items even still have their tags attached, including this great dress that I wore on the Australian Today show last week. Sustainable, stylish, and totally affordable. You'll look and feel good with ThreadUp. And for Food Psych listeners, here's an exclusive offer. You can get an extra 30% off your first order at threadup.com/foodpsych. That's threadup.com/FOODPSYCH for 30% off your first order. threadup.com/foodpsych for an extra 30% off today. Terms apply. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Ayana Habtemariam. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
My relationship with food growing up, it was good and it was complicated. The good part consisted of spending lots of time with my family and having access to lots of great food and a lot of social connection. It includes memories of meal times with my grandparents, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles. Almost every Sunday after church, we would go over to my grandmother's house and stay there for dinner. And she always had really good food cooking. She had a garden and she even used her neighbor's garden and grew herbs and collard greens and tomatoes. And even her partner, one of my grandfathers, was a really good cook. So there was always some good food around just all the time. And it was similar with my paternal grandparents too. With them, I just remember a lot of pig's feet and chitlins and lima beans and collard greens. And they would even make food like that for their dog. Yeah, it was funny. And honestly, it was the hood. It wasn't like a really safe neighborhood, or it wasn't a neighborhood that people really wanted to go to. And it was a food desert, but I honestly don't remember experiencing any food insecurity. And so it gets a little more complicated with my personal experience with my body and food. And I have a couple of different layers to this. And so the first layer, I'd say, when I was really young, I was in about the third grade, I experienced something that really changed the way I saw myself as a little girl. And it stayed with me for a really long time. So I remember very clearly being excited about school and making friends, because this was a new school. And I was standing really close to a girl in my class, and I was smiling and I was happy because I was a kid and I wanted to make friends. So I was standing really close to her and noticed that she was looking at me with a really disgusted look on her face. And I was confused. I didn't know why. And she looked at my skin and said, "What's that? Why did your skin look like that?" And I tried to explain to her that I had chicken pox. And when you scratch chicken pox, they get dark and the marks just stayed there. And even till this day, I hyperpigment really, really bad. But I just thought in my 3-year-old brain that my skin was bad. And she had said that her skin didn't do that. And since her skin didn't do that, I just figured that her skin was better, and the messages in the media and all around me kind of confirmed that anyway. And I just want to make it clear that my mom was really deliberate in the way she spoke highly of Black people and our skin and our hair and our abilities and our contributions to the world. But that incident, I feel like, still affected me more than all the positive affirmations and everything else that my mom tried to instill in me. So I think that was like my earliest memory or earliest experience that may have affected my body, because even as I grew older and my thighs got bigger and I got like light stretch marks, it was just devastating. I was like, oh my God, I have these marks on my body. I look, who gets this? This is just me.
Yeah, it sounds like she made you feel really weird for what your body did naturally. And so any sort of mark on your body subsequently, I can see how that would feel like this almost like mark of otherness, mark of not belonging.
Yes, exactly. That's a perfect way to describe it. It is. And so I would say there are a couple other layers. Another layer is that throughout my life, I've been exposed to comments about my build. So, for example, I have a sister who's almost 2 years older than me, and she's naturally slim. And throughout our lives, people have always compared her to our mom. So they'd say things like, Shanna is built like your mom. And even my dad back in the day would be like, your mom was so bad back in the day. And my mom had, like, when we saw pictures of her, I would describe her as maybe like a slim, thick kind of build. She was thin, but curvy. And so I was always compared to bigger boned family members. And those comparisons were normal to me. They didn't bother me, or at least I didn't think that they bothered me. But what I do think is that it was there in my subconscious, in my subconscious mind, lying dormant, if you will. And even though it didn't bother me then, I do think that it eventually culminated with some other things into my disordered eating and body image issues that I had later on.
Yeah. What do you think brought that on? What triggered those disordered eating issues?
There's actually one more layer. And so it's kind of what I described. Well, I can tell you this story. I was actually at the doctor's office when I was like 15 years old and got on the scale. And the number was it just seemed like a big number to me. And I think all those memories or all those experiences kind of flooded back. It's like the number on the scale says you're big. You have big bones, or you're like a husky build or chunky. And, people in my family also said I ate a lot, and I did eat a lot. I loved food when I was a kid. I would even say that I was preoccupied with food. And I always heard those stories too. And I honestly believe that my individual needs were just higher than the average kid, maybe. And the adults around me just had a limit set in their heads about how much a kid should eat. And so even now, my mom tells me stories, or just tells stories about how I was a greedy child. And, she smiles about it and it seems nostalgic for her. So I'm not angry at her or anything about it. But sometimes I do tell her, I'm like, Mom, I don't feel like hearing it. But I think all those things did affect that, or contribute to my disordered relationship with my food and with my body.
It makes so much sense, especially the sort of judgment of being greedy or eating too much as a kid, because your body, it seemed like, just needed what it needed, and everybody has different appetites. And if they had sort of been open to that, or served you more food, or allowed for you to have more food when you wanted it, maybe that would have been different. But having sort of a limit imposed, I can understand why that would make you feel a scarcity mindset.
Yeah. And it wasn't like there was a limit imposed all the time. So my grandparents, for example, they would just feed us and feed us and feed us. But it was more of, I was just aware that I ate a lot because people always said it, and so I was just like, I eat a lot. I eat too much. I'm greedy. That's what I was told.
Oh, that's so sad. And it sounds like, even if the value judgments weren't there necessarily with regard to body stuff, like if they weren't saying, oh, you're big boned and that's bad, nobody was necessarily saying that, but those messages still got across in that judgment of your food and how much you ate.
Yes. Yep, they did.
That sounds really hard. And it definitely sounds like a tinderbox in terms of like setting you up for disordered eating later on.
Yeah, it really did. And of course, during that time, I didn't connect it. I didn't connect it at all. It's not something that I connected until I became an adult. I just thought that it was the thing to do, to lose weight. People praised me for it. People were like, oh, you look great. I had family members who said, how do you lose weight so easily? And I was proud of it. I was very proud of it for a long time.
How old were you when you started trying to lose weight?
I was 16. The episode happened at the doctor's office when I was 15, but I clearly remember being 16 because I had just got a summer job at Burger King. Actually, not a summer job. I had held that job until I went to college, and I had enough money to go to Blockbuster and buy Tybo tapes. And I did Tybo in my living room, and I would eat Burger King food because I worked there, but I ate significantly less than I usually would have. So I would be hungry in school. My fingers would be shaking in school. I would be lightheaded, but I looked great. I thought I looked great, and other people thought I looked great too. So that was really all that mattered.
Right. That praise really fans the flames of the disordered eating.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like you were experiencing negative consequences, but those were not enough to stop you. It didn't outweigh the benefit of the praise at that point.
No, it didn't. That wasn't enough. I was actually, sometimes when I was weak or if I was shaking, I looked at it as a good thing. I looked at it as, oh, good, this is working. I'm not going to eat. I'm going to continue this. The thing is, I really like to eat. So I didn't completely, I still ate and I would binge. I think at that time I would eat large amounts at a time. I can't remember that clearly, but I know as I became an adult, in my 20s, I would eat a lot later on. I would skip meals or eat a day and then go home and just raid the refrigerator or go to the store and buy a bunch of pizza or something like that.
Yeah, so that restrict binge cycle, it sounds like got set up pretty early.
Oh yeah, it did.
How did it progress from there? It sounds like when you got to college, maybe it intensified even more.
So in college, it intensified, but I had a meal plan and I was around people who dieted. I had a friend who it was almost like a competition of which of us could only eat a day. She'd be like, yeah, I can only eat a day and I'll only eat a day. So it was kind of supported when I was in college. I don't even know. I mean, we ate just because we had to eat based on the meal plan and what was available on campus, but it was restricted. I wasn't eating enough, definitely.
Yeah, and having that competition with a friend also makes it that much more intense, I feel like. I remember having certain friends that I would diet with or restrict with, and it was kind of like once you said it, once it was like, oh yeah, I'm only going to have this much, or I'm totally full now, or whatever it is, saying that out loud to someone, I feel like kind of made me feel locked into it. Like I had to then play the role, even if I was still hungry, even if I was starving, even if I was not at all satisfied, I would like say that I was satisfied in order to try to compete with the other person, or also just like lock myself into not eating more.
Yeah, that happened a lot. And on top of that, I was a nutrition major. And so I felt like I had to be an example of how to eat, so I would do talks on campus. One of my friends was in a sorority and had me speak to her at an event at her sorority about nutrition. And the information I gave was probably just completely wrong about weight loss because I was dieting, I was restricting, I wasn't getting enough nutrition. So that affected it too. That impacted that as well, being a nutrition major.
Oh, I can imagine. I know for me, like I went back to school later to do my master's degree in public health nutrition and then also get my dietitian's license. So I was older by that point, but like, even so, I still felt this pressure to be like the good nutrition student, eat like other people and sort of have the body that would look like a dietitian, whatever that means.
Yeah. Yep.
And I can only imagine, especially going in as an undergrad, how much more intense that can be because you're so early in your life and kind of like figuring out your path. And so like having this identity as I'm the nutrition student is incredibly limiting. I feel like it kind of boxes you in.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to describe it.
How did you get interested in nutrition in the first place? Like, why did you decide to major in nutrition?
I wasn't sure what I wanted to major in, and somebody from the department invited me to take a nutrition course. And when I took that nutrition course, I said, "Oh, this is perfect. This is for me." And I just thought about how I could help my community in Philadelphia be healthy and eat healthy. And I became really interested in community and public health nutrition. I just thought that I could help people be healthy. And at that time, or by that time, both of my paternal grandparents had died of complications related to diabetes and probably some cardiovascular issues as well. But on the surface, it seemed really related to diabetes. So I was really passionate about chronic disease reduction through nutrition education and just through, knowledge, increasing knowledge within Black communities.
Yeah, so I can understand why that would attract you to nutrition. It seems like it's the way to help people help prevent diseases and complications of diseases like what happened to your grandparents.
Yeah. And at that time, and even the way that nutrition is taught, you're not taught about, I think we are taught about the social determinants of health, but we're not taught about other forms or other, I guess I should say, forms of structural racism and oppression and all those other things that contribute to why a community or an entire community would be unhealthy. It's historical. It's not just a one and done kind of thing. It's something that has been happening over generations. So I didn't know that, and I just thought I could kind of save the world and save my community. That's what I thought.
It's so interesting how that works, because I also experienced that when I was in school for public health nutrition. We had a social determinants of health class and like an environmental health determinants or something too. So there are those classes that were sort of like over here on one side. And on the other side, it was like, food is going to kill you or food is going to save you. And those classes, but there was never sort of like a bridging of those things or sort of a larger context of like, I do remember actually my social determinants professor gently saying, because I think he knew he had a lot of public health nutrition people in the public health nutrition concentration in his class, but sort of being like, food is not really a factor, and, kind of like being a little cagey about it, but saying basically that that food didn't have that much to do with it, as opposed to things like racism and income inequality and other forms of social inequity. But it just went right over my head at the time, and then later on I looked back at my notebooks and I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's so framed, I think, in nutrition classes as like individual responsibility and individual choices will save you from these outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. And I believe that for a long time. Even after I got my MSW degree, I still felt as if individuals, if they had the tools and the knowledge, could create that change in their own lives and in their own communities, as if they, existed in a bubble. What I'm trying to say is we live in a socially unjust world, and knowledge and education can't protect us from the social injustices. I think that's what I'm trying to say. We're going to be affected by that, especially marginalized communities.
It's so true that nutrition gets framed as this way to like prevent and cure diseases that are so largely influenced by and often can be triggered by the stress of marginalization, which these individual choices don't really do anything to address, and sometimes even can further the disconnection and alienation within communities.
Yep, it definitely does.
But it's so normal and understandable too that you would think that the individual choices were the way, because that's what we're all conditioned to think. I remember thinking that too in my training to be a dietitian and just in my life, my career as a journalist. It's like that's what we're all taught. It's the American way. Individual responsibility.
Yep, it is.
I'm curious how you got from a nutrition student to doing your MSW and kind of what the path was there.
Yeah. So when I graduated, I didn't go directly into my dietetic internship. I moved back to Philly and I started working at the WIC office, one of the largest WIC offices in the city in Southwest Philadelphia, as a nutrition professional. That's what they called us. And just to give you a little bit of background, this office was in Southwest Philly, which is where both of my grandparents lived for decades. And I even had cousins who I would service there. So I felt very connected and very committed to that community. And I thought that I would go in there and change the world. So I realized soon after trying to put my all into the education component, that the WIC benefit and the nutrition education component still wasn't enough for me to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. I wanted to see behavior change. I was hoping to see people's lives change. And, now I realize that was naive. And it kind of what we just talked about knowledge and information just isn't enough. So that was one of the main factors in choosing to pursue my MSW degree. And at that time, all I really knew was that social workers advocated for vulnerable people and connected them to resources. I didn't know the degree to which They participated in grassroots movements and the fight against social injustices and doing advocacy work in order to create social change, in order to bring social change about. I didn't realize that until I started my degree, and I loved it. It was just completely eye-opening. The policy, the advocacy, and grassroots movements were really exciting, and I saw a lot of potential in these types of intervention to decrease health disparities within marginalized communities.
That's great. So you really, it seems like, found your niche there.
Yeah, at that time I did. I was so into it. I ended up starting an organization. It wasn't a nonprofit or anything, but it was just an organization that partnered with local politicians in Philly to bring nutrition education to their constituents. And I did a lot of work even when I was in grad school around the nutrition environment or around the food environment. Some of that work, so for example, in 2010, Michael Nutter, the mayor at that time, had started talking about the soda tax. And I really supported the soda tax. And I had met with him and I told him that, and I testified in support of the soda tax. And I did a lot of my MSW policy work on that as well. And the thing is, now when I look back at it, and even then, I knew it was a paternalistic policy and a somewhat punitive policy. I knew that because in preparation for this, I was looking at some of my papers. I even wrote a paper on it being an ethical dilemma because, people still have a right to choose and make choices, even if, someone like me thinks that choice is harmful, and I had written a whole paper on that. And so when I look back, I'm like, wow, I was really into legislating behavior change, but I thought it was for people's benefit. And I was just really into it. I really thought that it would help. And now I don't really feel the same way.
Oh, I feel you so hard on that. I also went into nutrition policy as my first job in nutrition, like my first 3 years that I was working as a nutritionist. I was working in city Department of Health on nutrition policy initiatives and implementing policy and making sure agencies were following the policy. And it was all this some of it I think was beneficial in terms of just bringing more variety to the populations we were serving, but also some of it was this very paternalistic, like, oh, you can't have that cereal because it has more than X grams of sugar or.
Yes. And I think it's still like that. I think the WIC offices do they still, I don't know, it's been years, but I think they still say which cereals you can have and which cereals you can't have.
I think so. That's, the last I looked into it, I think it was like that. And I feel like a lot of government agencies are like that. Any agency that has food service as a part of it, like Department of Homeless Services or what have you, especially for a lot of local governments, I feel like they have these strict guidelines on what is allowed to be served and what isn't. Or with the WIC, it's what people can use their benefits for. And that paternalism, I think, is really problematic. And I also remember at the time knowing that was an argument against it and sort of being like, yes, it is paternalistic, but, the benefit outweighs the negative.
Yes, I said that. I even said that. I don't even know why I'm saying this, but at some point I said that I know it's paternalistic, but I'm a dietitian and I'm a part of this community. My family has suffered from their food environment. So I know better. Plus, I'm part of this community. I don't even know if I really want to admit that, but that was my argument for it.
And that's so understandable. I feel like when you first start learning about the food environment, that's what gets put across is like, this food environment is harmful. These particular foods are harmful. And so in order to help people's health and change these health disparities, we have to legislate it because there's no way, because people are just going to choose whatever is convenient otherwise. And so legislation is the only way. I feel like that's really the message that a lot of public health programs put across.
Yeah, it is. And you know what it reminds me of? I know when I was doing my intuitive eating training and we talk about, a lot about autonomy and how humans just naturally need that and that it's something that we fight for. But also it reminds me of scarcity. And we're saying, no, you can't have this, and it creates that need to want it. Even if you really don't want it, having someone tell you that you can't have it makes you just want it more, and I think it's the same with the soda tax and the policies that we talked about, even with food stamps. I don't know if it's the same with food stamps, but I know at one point you couldn't buy hot foods, prepared foods. And that's big in communities, especially food deserts. You know what I mean? Just buying foods that are hot, because there aren't a lot of grocery stores, but they're like the mini markets and stuff that have the prepared foods. You know how you have like a strip with a pawn shop or a laundromat or something, and then like the little mini market or something. And restricting that, I feel like, makes people just want it more.
Yeah, it's like the forbidden fruit tastes the sweetest.
Yes.
And those foods really do serve a purpose, like those hot foods in communities like that where people don't have access to grocery stores to cook, or maybe don't have stoves to cook with, or
Yes.
cooking implements. And because I feel like even cooking just takes so much privilege. There are so many things that have to fall into place in order to be able to cook, like having the time, because it is basically you're doing your own free labor cooking. You have to have time. You have to have the time not just to cook the food, but also to prepare and chop and get everything ready. And if you're cooking from scratch, it takes a long time. And if you're working multiple jobs or whatever, like have kids to take care of, it doesn't really fit in necessarily. And then all those other things too, like having gas, having a stove, having the utensils. There's a lot that has to be in place in order to do it. So I get why prepared foods exist, and it's kind of a necessity in some areas.
And I just don't think a lot of the people who are writing these policies, they don't realize that. They don't consult with these communities. Even when I was testifying in support of the soda tax, and there was this other legislation that I was hoping a council member would sponsor, because at that time, Philadelphia was rewriting the zoning laws. And I wanted them to implement some zoning restrictions for fast food restaurants not close to stores and things like that. I didn't talk to the community about that. I didn't try to mobilize anyone to say, well, if we take these away, what are we going to put in its place? I didn't do any of that. So I think I was saying that to say the people who write these policies, they don't consider any of that. They don't consider any of what you said, like just cooking and time and convenience and that labor.
I mean, I think that's such a great point too. The sort of unintended consequences of it don't get considered. And even when it's someone like you who had grown up in that community and was really connected to that community, so you were like ostensibly a stakeholder in that community whose voice was being heard, you had a different agenda. You had a different take than maybe other members of the community would have. And the fact that your voice was the one that got heard, and you were pushing the sort of typical dietitian type of point of view with that, versus the people who were not dietitians, who were just trying to go about their lives and have convenient food to eat. It was a very different point of view.
Yeah, it's true.
I fully get that. I feel like dietitians also tend to get listened to more in those scenarios. I feel like we have a certain like educational privilege and an assumption that we understand something about nutrition that everyone else doesn't.
Yeah, we do. We really do. I just wish that we had more education, or the curriculum included more about the social environment and those other factors, not just, education and knowledge and information, because it's so much more than that. And maybe they do now. I don't know. I guess I should find out if that's being included in some of the curriculums.
Yeah, I feel like maybe some places are, and maybe it's getting better. But from the dietetic students I've talked to in programs now, it seems like there's still a lot of just individual responsibility being pushed.
Yeah.
That's frustrating.
Yeah, hopefully it'll change.
I know. I really hope so. Well, I feel like just us having this conversation and people starting to become aware of the social determinants of health and the problems with this framing of purely individual responsibility, I think is helpful. Because in my book, I write about the history of diet culture, and I talk about the transition around the early 2000s from like just straight up above board diet culture to this more like sneaky, nuanced form that I call the wellness diet, where it started with like Michael Pollan and Eric Schlosser and Marion Nestle, like these people talking and writing about the food environment and kind of bringing that idea more into the mainstream, which was like such a game changer in a lot of ways because nobody was really considering that before, but also had all of these unintended consequences that nobody really saw at the time, or some people did, but I think the mainstream didn't really see until now. It's getting, that kind of way of thinking about things like demonizing so-called processed foods or convenience foods and elevating whole plant-based, blah, blah, blah. That has really hurt a lot of people, I think, in the years since that idea came on the scene, including me. Like I was, definitely one who got very burned by the sort of orthorexic thinking and restrictive ways of approaching food. And so now I think people are finally starting to talk about that and look at that, but it was like a couple decades of that getting entrenched now.
Yeah, it was. And I was in that. I really was. And it really influenced a lot of the work that I did back then. And even still now, the food environment it's a really touchy subject for me, and it's really personal for me. And I'm a little bit all over the place with this, but I still hold it partly responsible for a lot of the health issues that I saw take my loved ones away. And I say that knowing full well how stress and how racism and how access to quality healthcare affects well-being. I also say that as someone who's aware of and understands the role that healthism and diet culture plays in how a lot of vulnerable and marginalized people view themselves. So I know that full well, but for some reason, I still blame partly, not 100%, of course, the food environment.
That's interesting, that sort of dichotomy that still exists for you.
Yeah, it does. And I guess I struggle with it. We're constantly told that we're unhealthy and more likely to develop chronic diseases. And I'm talking about mostly Black communities, and we're more likely to develop chronic diseases. And often we're made to believe that it's our fault and that we can bootstrap our way out of it. And I think that this creates morbid thinking. And I think that we internalize these thoughts and they become what we believe about ourselves. And I'm aware of how diet culture demonizes less privileged and marginalized communities. And it depicts our neighborhoods as wastelands, with nothing to offer but corner stores. And that's not true. I know it's not true. A lot of people know that it's not true, but it is a belief that this larger construct of healthism perpetuates. And it's used against us, and it's used to put us down, and it's used as an attempt to oppress us. And I think where I struggle with this is I don't think diet culture did that. I think that that's racism and redlining and the war against drugs. The war against drugs devastated Black communities, and the myth of the welfare queen, which people still use to say that Black women are single moms and are lazy and that Black fathers are absent. People still say those things. I was watching some Netflix documentary and somebody was portraying Black people like that. Like, well, they don't want to eat right and they don't want to do this. And I'm just like, it's not true, And so I just don't think diet culture did that. I know diet culture makes things exponentially worse and intensifies those feelings of hopelessness. And it makes us forget about all of those things that I just mentioned and all of the things that you mentioned earlier. It makes us forget about those. It makes us say, oh, it's us. It's the diet. So it takes and places all of that blame and responsibility back on the individual. So it's harmful and it's horrible, but I just struggle with not blaming the food environment. It's just something that has stayed with me because, like I said, the food environment was created in the neighborhoods and in poverty. The way that it was created was so systematic. It was created in a way so that it is the way it is today. And diet culture just exacerbates it. It just makes it 1,000 times worse.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that the reason the food environment is the way it is in communities of color and poor communities is not just diet culture. It's these larger systemic problems that predated diet culture, actually. I mean, even going back to, I had Sabrina Strings on the podcast to talk about her book, Fearing the Black Body, and how racism preceded fat phobia. And racism was really at the root of fat phobia, specifically anti-Blackness was like at the root of fat phobia. And that was such a huge part of the genesis of diet culture. Racism is kind of like this umbrella system of oppression that houses diet culture within it, but also a lot of other sub-related systems of oppression.
Yeah, I agree. I remember that episode too. It was really good.
Yeah, she's amazing. And I feel like that sort of elucidating those roots is really powerful and important because it shows that diet culture is oppressive largely because of its racist and misogynist and other oppressive roots, but also it's not just diet culture that creates those ideas. And also, I think, something that I've been thinking about lately, because people will ask me, I definitely get, a number of public health students or just people who are interested in the food environment asking me, like, do you really think that there's absolutely nothing, there's no responsibility that food companies bear or whatever? And I feel like I'm really careful in how I talk about that because I never want to demonize particular types of food. And I think diet culture does so much of that, that feeling like we have access and we deserve to eat anything we want is of utmost importance. But I also think that there is a real complicity with the food industry and the diet industry, and that actually diet culture is part of the food environment, because I've seen in the research that people who are deprived of food, and the research is really on mostly dieters, but we also see this in people with food insecurity too, in the more limited research that we have on people with food insecurity, that those conditions of deprivation drive binging and drive feeling out of control with food, and also drive preferentially selecting the foods that diet culture happens to demonize, which are like, quote unquote, highly palatable, more carbohydrate rich or salty and sugary and high in fat. And that condition of deprivation like sets people up to crave those foods and also to feel less able to stop when they're full or to modulate their eating of those foods. It's sort of like this all or nothing kind of swing. And I think that in marginalized communities that disproportionately suffer food insecurity and also disproportionately suffer weight stigma, because weight stigma sort of intersects with other forms of oppression to heighten all of the oppression. I think that like that piece of it actually makes, when food companies then come in and like situate fast food restaurants in the middle of a poor community of color, or, in the middle of a lower income community of any ethnicity, mixed or whatever, I think that they at some level know that there's a greater market for their food or their products, whatever it may be, in communities that don't have access and that are deprived, because we know that people who are deprived just tend to gravitate towards those kinds of foods more intensely and not feel as able to stop when they're full, or to feel fullness before a point of like discomfort. Whereas people who are intuitive eaters and who aren't dieters or who've never suffered food insecurity don't seem to have that same relationship with food. I do think that the food industry and also like the food industry includes diet food companies, and diet food companies are often housed within larger companies that make other types of food. It's like a food company, a large food manufacturer will have its like diet brands under it. And there's never any question that it's going to have diet brands. So I think it's kind of an interesting nexus of oppression happening and also diet culture coming in and the food industry coming in and capitalizing on that.
Yes, I agree. You said so many things that I agree with. And that's what I mean. It's like some of the views that I have, they kind of clash. But yeah, I agree. And I think too, so for people who do have less access to a variety of foods and have more health concerns or a disability or a need for more convenience or just can't make ends meet, I think it's so important for them to be aware of that, to be aware of how the food industry contributes to the way their environment is, and to be aware of all those things that you just said. And I think they can interact with their environment different when they're aware of it, when they know, well, the reason I'm craving these foods is because maybe something happened during childhood or because of food insecurity. My body needs this energy. I think that's so important. And I just wish that, like with intuitive eating, I wish more people had access to it. So, because I think we are becoming more aware of our environments, just with social media. And like you said, there's more of a conversation around the food environment. But I don't think we're that aware of how and why we interact with our environments in the ways that we do. So like what you just explained. So I just think it's so important that in addition to knowing that there's less access and there's less variety, and variety is really important. So in addition to knowing that, knowing why you might interact with your environment the way you do.
Yeah. And I think that that's so important too for like reducing blame and the sort of feeling of like, I'm bad, I can't make the right choices or whatever, that I think a lot of people, as you described earlier, kind of like especially communities of color, are made to feel that they're doing it wrong and making the wrong choices, or that they're responsible for the health disparities that they face, instead of recognizing these are larger forces at play. And that, yeah, if you're craving particular kinds of food, it's not because you lack willpower and you're bad, but because you've been deprived and maybe still are deprived. And these are the kinds of foods that your body gravitates towards when that happens. And like, at some level, that's really protective, right? There's like a coping and survival benefit to that, where we need food. And when we are deprived of food and we end up sort of swinging over to the side of craving kind of like energy dense foods, that actually helps us survive and not waste away, not die.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated thing.
It is.
How did you get interested in intuitive eating? How did that piece come into your work?
So that was a personal thing. I myself hit diet rock bottom, and I couldn't diet anymore. I was tired of exercising as hard as I exercise. I was tired of restricting and gaining weight. And I started gaining a little bit more, not a little bit more weight, but I was really good at dieting for probably from the age of 16 to like 27. And then when I was in grad school, I gained a bunch of weight. And then when I finished grad school, I lost it. But recently, over the past 2 years, it just became really hard. And I got tired of it. I naturally, before I stopped dieting, I stopped exercising. I used to go to fitness, and I completely just said, I'm not doing this anymore. This is ridiculous. And so I stopped. Then I did a diet and lost some weight and was under some stress and gained it back. And after that, I was done with it. And I'm really grateful for the intuitive eating community on social media, because I don't think that I think I would have eventually crossed paths with it, but I did a lot sooner. And I'm so glad I did, because I really think that this is something that is needed in a lot of other communities besides just white women. It seems like those are the only people who know about it and who are practicing intuitive eating. And I just think that it could benefit a lot more people.
Absolutely. I think that's awesome that you are working to bring intuitive eating to a more diverse audience and to your community, because it seems like there is this sort of income and racial disparity in who even has access to knowledge about intuitive eating and to the practice of intuitive eating. So to be able to bring that knowledge and practice to your community that in a way that, could actually resonate is really awesome.
Yeah. And that's what I'm working on. I've been really quiet on social media lately, and I have so many ideas. I'm working on a free resource now, like an ebook for people who may not be able to afford, traditional services. And it's just like a starter thing, playing around with different things. But yeah, trying to figure a lot of stuff out.
I'm curious too how the sort of income piece comes into play with it. Because we were talking a little bit off mic about the difficulties in access and the differences in how accessible intuitive eating can be or how accessible food is in general in different communities. So curious what you're thinking along those lines.
Yeah, so I'm thinking a couple different things. I wanted to, for individuals, offer kind of deeply discounted services for mothers, single women, moms who have body image issues. And I think it's more common than a lot of people think it is, especially in Black communities with Black women. A lot of people think that, and research shows that Black women report being satisfied at higher BMIs. But I think that's just because our BMIs don't reflect the same way that they reflect with other people. It's not like they're saying that they report being satisfied in much larger bodies. I think a lot of people say this BMI is this number, so it must look this way. That's not the case. I don't think that's the case, especially with a lot of Black women. So a lot of people assume that we don't have body image issues, but a lot of us do. So I'm interested in providing deeply discounted services for people who qualify. And I'm also really interested in intuitive eating for communities and for groups. I don't know if or how I can apply it to communities and groups, but I think that's also a good way to help people save money or help people afford it who may not be able to afford it. So that's what I'm thinking so far. I'm hoping also that more community programs and organizations can incorporate the principles of intuitive eating or properly do it. So I work with the American Institute on Cancer Research on their New American DC Plate Challenge. And one of the people who recruited me, she's like, I really love that you are an advocate for intuitive eating. So she brought me on to help with that aspect of the program. So I'd like to see more of that. There are a lot of public health programs and community-based programs, and hopefully people can catch on to it and try to bring someone in, a counselor in, who can then train lay people or pay for training for lay facilitators or something. And I think that would be a really good way to disseminate it throughout the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, just because also we were talking earlier about the problems with the sort of paternalistic approach to public health nutrition that exists out there now. And this would be such a powerful alternative to that, helping actually teach people intuitive eating or even just build in principles of intuitive eating to like food service in community settings or nutrition education in community settings, whatever it may be, is so powerful and so different. So against the sort of traditional diet culture way that things are done right now.
Yeah.
I love that, there's organizations out there thinking of that too. I think that really speaks to this like cultural moment where intuitive eating is coming into the public consciousness.
Yeah, I am too. I was really surprised. And on some of the documents and the weekly emails that we were sending out, it has ways to incorporate intuitive eating. And, there are still things that we could probably add or remove throughout some of the program documents. But just the fact that they are making that effort says a lot. It says something.
Oh, it says so much. What do you think are some nuances of intuitive eating in communities of color or maybe the Black community that you work with that you want people to understand?
That's a good question. I would say one thing that really comes to mind is we're constantly told, and I guess research does support it, that we have higher rates of chronic illnesses like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease. I think that just makes it more difficult to have people follow some of the principles. So for example, like unconditional permission to eat. I think a lot of people would be like, well, no, I can't do that, and not realizing that if they're binging or if they're craving, it just makes more sense to give themselves unconditional permission to eat, to go through that period of it. If they're very sensitive, or if it's the case that eating one thing will send them over the edge, which I think is unlikely or rare, then we can try other things. But that's something that I've worried about from the beginning, and something that people have always asked me about. People have always said, well, no, that doesn't work for us. We have too many health problems. Or somebody said to me, well, if somebody is drowning right now, if they need your help right now to lose weight at this moment, I'm going to put them on a diet, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. And I'm like, I mean, they're not going to, I don't know, there are just too many risks to do that, number one. But what are you going to do in a month? What are you going to do right now to change that? So it does take some convincing and a lot of explaining. So that's one thing. The other thing is respecting your body and your here and now body. With a lot of Black women, especially, our bodies are everything. Our bodies determine how people treat us and how people see us and how people judge us. So telling someone that is so used to being judged by the way they look and the size of their body, and being treated with more respect and more dignity because of the way their body looks, to respect their body and just worry about their well-being and how it feels. People have laughed at me for that. Right now, I'm experiencing people just like on social media, and these are people who I know personally, just not feeling what I'm saying. I'm feeling it. I'm feeling that, not isolation, but I'm feeling that people are just like, I'm not here for this. It's not going to stop me. I think it's going to eventually they'll get it and they'll see where I'm coming from. But I know I had said that I was fat positive or fat acceptance. I forgot what I had said. And somebody messaged me and was like, what is this? You're a dietitian. Why are you promoting this? And like I said, these are people who I've known, who have followed me for a long time and who I know personally. So that's another thing that I feel like I'm going to be struggling with. The thing is, once people make appointments with me, or once I get clients or a discovery call and at least have a first appointment, they get it. Once you start doing the activities and you start, talking about hunger and fullness and satisfaction, they're like, oh, it's almost like you have to experience it to get it. And even with social media, like I know I was just talking about social media and people just like being not here for what I'm saying about fat acceptance and stuff. I think that if I word things differently, I'm trying to figure out how to word things, especially on Instagram, so that people can understand it. So that's something I'm still working on.
It's really tricky. I think getting the message across to people who are really far away from any understanding of fat positivity and intuitive eating and other anti-diet kind of language, it's talking across such a huge divide. And then I can understand too why there's this added layer of pressure when you're constantly told that your community is at higher risk of these things, and people are kind of running scared of chronic diseases, that it feels very impossible to like let go for any period of time and just like allow their bodies. And it's very hard, I think, for everyone to trust that that period will end. What I call the honeymoon phase with intuitive eating, where you first start giving yourself unconditional permission to eat and then gravitate towards those foods that were off limits before in like a big way, that's eventually going to end, and that you're going to really be okay with all foods and able to incorporate all foods and have variety and have pleasure with things that you had deemed quote unquote good before, and also with things that you had deemed quote unquote bad. I think that's like a tough thing to trust for everyone in diet culture, but especially when you're told you have chronic disease risk hanging over your head.
Yeah, it really is. I even think sharing individual experiences can be helpful with that. Because I was thinking about sharing something, because I used to binge on sweets a lot. And I never thought I was addicted to sweets. But since starting my intuitive eating journey, my unconditional permission to eat phase lasted a while. But I do not crave sweets. It's really interesting. It's fascinating to me. It really is. Even today, I was really hungry. I was really busy. And I was like, what do I really want to eat? Because I still ask myself that question. What is it that I really want to eat? And nothing ever comes to mind. It's so funny. It's like before, when I was restricting, I could have thought of 1,000 things to eat.
Oh, yes.
I could have gone and got cookies, cakes, ramen, all kinds of things. So many things would come to my mind. Now it's hard. It's really, it's really interesting. It's crazy.
I have that too. It's funny, like just not being that fussed about food or that interested in, it's like, yeah, I could eat this or that or whatever, but nothing is calling to me the way it used to just call.
Yeah.
But I think that personal experience too is really helpful to be able to say, like, I've been there, I've been through this, and I know what you're thinking and I know what you're worried about. And I can tell you that there is another side, that you could get to the other side and it's not going to be like that forever.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's so great to talk with you, and I could talk with you forever, but tell us where people can learn more about your work and find you online.
So online, I'm mostly on Instagram, though I have been quiet recently, but my handle is at the Trill RD, TRILL RD, and that's the same on Twitter, which I'm not really active on at all, and also on Facebook at the Trill RD. And my website is trulyrealnutrition.com.
Awesome. We'll put links to all that in the show notes too, so people can find you and connect with you. And thank you so much for being here. It's really great talking with you. And I had such a great time with this conversation. I think people are going to really learn a lot. So thank you.
Thank you, Christy. And I hope so.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Ayana Habtemariam for joining us on this episode. And thanks to you for listening. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. If you're looking for some tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path for yourself, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, you can go to christyharrison.com/227. That's christyharrison.com/227. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by ThreadUp. Shopping sustainably just got a whole lot easier and more affordable with ThreadUp. Get an exclusive offer of an extra 30% off your first order when you go to threadup.com/foodpsych. That's threadup.com/FOODPSYCH for 30% off your first order today. Terms apply. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs, and I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.